What if I told you there are places in the world where a woman's body is not her own? Where the greatest act of hospitality isn't a meal or a bed, but a man's wife? And what if I told you this isn't a forgotten legend or a twisted myth, but a real tradition that has been practiced for centuries, and in some isolated regions, still lives on in the shadows of modern civilization? Welcome to the icy, brutal world of the Chukchi people of northeastern Siberia, one of the most isolated and harsh environments on Earth, and home to one of the most shocking customs you're ever going to hear. A place where men endure blizzards and hunger for survival, and where survival has shaped a morality that to outsiders seems completely unrecognizable. Among the Chukchi, there was a tradition called ngatutgyn, a word that roughly translates to guest sharing, but don't let the soft syllables fool you. This custom meant that when a traveler arrived in your home, you were not just expected to offer him shelter from the deadly cold, or food scraped together from reindeer and fish. No, you were expected to offer your wife, or your daughter, or your sister, and not as decoration, but as a full participant in his pleasure. The man of the house would step aside. The guest would enter the family tent, and if the woman refused, she would bring shame not only on herself, but on the entire household. Because in this world, hospitality was survival, and survival meant trust, and trust meant intimacy, sometimes forced, sometimes accepted, but always demanded. To us, it may seem like something out of a dystopian novel, but to them, it was a moral code passed down through generations. And don't assume it was just the man's will. The women, too, were raised in this logic, taught from childhood that a guest is sacred, that their bodies were not private but communal property when hospitality was on the line. In many cases, women complied without protest, but not because they wanted to, because they had no choice. Because refusing a guest could bring conflict, curses, or even expulsion from the community. And in a land where -60 degrees means instant death, being cast out is a death sentence. But who are the Chukchi really, and how did this begin? The Chukchi are an indigenous people who inhabit the Chukotka Peninsula in the farthest northeastern corner of Russia, where the Bering Sea meets the Arctic Ocean. For centuries, they lived as nomadic reindeer herders and hunters, battling snowstorms, polar nights, and unimaginable cold. Their contact with outsiders was minimal until the Soviet era. Isolated from mainstream Russian life, they developed social systems radically different from those in the West. Marriage among the Chukchi was flexible. Monogamy was not strictly enforced, and women were not necessarily property. But they weren't free either. What mattered most was the group, not the individual. And that group depended on unbreakable bonds of loyalty and mutual aid. So when a stranger came knocking, exhausted and frozen, the man of the house had one duty: to offer everything he had, including the most intimate thing in his life, his wife. He might sit outside the tent, he might sleep with the reindeer, or in some cases, he'd quietly leave the woman and the guest alone in the sleeping skins, pretending nothing was wrong. In fact, the more generous the host, the more honor he gained. And if the guest declined, that was the insult. That meant you didn't think the host's wife was worthy. That meant war. What's more disturbing is how normalized it was. This wasn't a twisted exception. It was expected. A guest might stay one night or several. He might choose when and how to exercise the right. And the woman was rarely asked for her feelings. In public, she might serve tea or smile politely. In private, she prepared herself for what was coming. But here's the twist. This wasn't just about sex. It was about bonding, trust, spiritual connection. In Chukchi beliefs, bodily union was a way to exchange energy, to ensure safe travels, to offer blessings. Some even believed that the guest would carry part of the woman's soul with him, like a good luck charm in human form. And still, it gets darker, because this hospitality wasn't always limited to adult women. In extreme cases, if the wife was unavailable, the daughter would be offered. Sometimes barely a teenager. In these communities, age was not a barrier. The younger the girl, the more pure the offering. Shocking? Yes. Illegal today? Certainly. But that doesn't erase the centuries in which it was not just permitted, but praised. In Part 2, we'll explore how this brutal custom collided with Soviet modernity, how Russian officials tried and failed to erase it, and whether whispers of it still echo today. When the Soviet Union extended its grasp across the vast frozen wilderness of Siberia, it eventually reached the Chukchi people. With it came a wave of forced modernization, ideological reprogramming, and cultural suppression. The Soviets saw the ancient traditions of indigenous tribes as primitive, backward, even dangerous. And among those traditions, the practice of guest sharing stood out as especially repugnant to the eyes of Moscow officials. The Soviet state launched aggressive campaigns to erase what it called sexual savagery and patriarchal superstition. They introduced schools, collective farms, state-appointed leaders, and even sent doctors and anthropologists to document and dismantle the Chukchi way of life. Soviet educators told women that they had rights, that their bodies were their own, that no man, not even a husband, had the authority to trade them like cattle. And yet, change did not come easily or cleanly. Because what the Soviets underestimated was how deeply these customs were rooted in survival, psychology, and climate. In a land where life depends on others, where the community must come before the self, sharing was not just about sex, it was about keeping people alive. The attempt to remove this one thread threatened to unravel the entire social fabric. And so, despite official bans and secret police, the custom of ngatutgyn did not disappear overnight. It went underground, practiced in whispers behind closed tents, or quietly ignored by regional authorities, who themselves sometimes came from these communities, or even participated in the same rituals. Stories from the mid-20th century speak of guests arriving in remote villages and being offered tea, food, and then, with a subtle nod, a wife dressed in ceremonial furs. One account from a Soviet-era ethnographer who later defected told of how he was offered a young woman by an elder, who explained that this was not about lust, but about honoring his presence. To refuse would be to insult his entire clan. And though the ethnographer declined, he reported feeling the weight of eyes, suspicion, tension. It was not just a polite offer. It was a demand wrapped in a smile. And in some rare cases, women themselves internalized these expectations so deeply that they would offer themselves before being asked. But this was not empowerment. This was conditioning, passed down through generations, where silence was loyalty and pain was duty. But what happened when a woman refused? When someone dared to say no? The stories are rare but chilling. In one case from the 1970s, a young Chukchi woman who rejected a guest's approach was publicly shamed, not by her husband, but by the women of the village. Accused of dishonoring the community, she was ostracized, forced to live in a separate tent, fed only scraps, told she had shamed her ancestors. Her husband divorced her within a week, and she was sent back to her family in disgrace, a family that had no intention of taking her back. And in that frozen land, that meant one thing: exile, a slow death by cold, hunger, and loneliness. And here lies the true horror, not just the act itself, but the machinery around it. The pressure, the eyes, the silence, the knowledge that to survive, you had to obey. And while the Soviet regime attempted to outlaw such customs, their methods were often just as brutal: forced sterilizations, arranged re-education marriages, punishments for entire families that resisted. And so, between the iron fist of the state and the steel grip of tradition, women had nowhere to turn. They were trapped in a place where change was an illusion and escape was impossible. Even when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991 and Russia opened up to the world, not much changed in these far northern regions. Satellite towns decayed, supplies ran dry, and old traditions slowly crept back to life. Not openly, but in stories, fireside whispers, cautious nods. And now, in the 21st century, while such practices are no longer public nor officially accepted, echoes still remain. Researchers visiting Chukotka have noted that guest sharing may not be common, but the mindset behind it lingers. Male guests are still given special treatment. Women still withdraw when strangers arrive, and questions about marriage often return to one point: obedience. She was 14 when it happened for the first time. The fire crackled low in the reindeer hide tent, and the snow outside had buried the world in silence. A guest had come, one of her father's distant cousins, or perhaps just a traveler passing through. And though her mother said nothing, she knew what was expected of her. Her father handed her a fur blanket and nodded once. She didn't cry, she didn't speak. She simply walked behind the guest and disappeared into the shadows of the sleeping space. This is not a legend. It is the lived experience of dozens of women from Chukotka whose stories only now begin to surface. Whispered into recorders by anthropologists or shared in quiet interviews with outsiders. Their names are rarely known, their voices almost never heard. But their memories remain raw, brutal, and unforgettable. Some say they tried to fight back. One woman, now in her 70s, recalled locking herself in the supply shed, refusing to come out until the guest left. She was beaten, not by the guest, but by her own brother, who called her selfish, disobedient, unworthy. The pain, she says, was nothing compared to the shame. Another younger woman, born in the post-Soviet era, described how her grandmother trained her from childhood to be a good hostess, to serve food, to stay silent, to smile even when it hurt. When she asked why, her grandmother only said, "That's what keeps the family together." And yet, not all women accepted their fate quietly. Over time, especially in larger villages with some access to media and education, a small wave of resistance began. It started with questions. Why must I be silent? Why does my body belong to others? Why does kindness mean surrender? Some of these women fled to cities like Anadyr, or even further to Moscow, where they tried to start new lives far from the traditions of their ancestors. But even there, the past followed them. In nightmares. In phone calls from relatives asking why they dishonored the family. In the ache of isolation, because leaving the tradition meant losing everything. The tribe, the family, the only home they ever knew. Some returned, defeated. Others never looked back. And those who stayed often found subtle ways to rebel. They refused to prepare the guests' bedding. They delayed the tea. They left the tent entirely on the night of a visit. Small acts of defiance that didn't erase the expectation, but slowly chipped away at its power. But not all stories end in resistance. In some cases, women internalized the ritual as a source of pride, not because they loved it, but because they convinced themselves it gave them value. One woman told researchers that being chosen by many guests meant she was beautiful, desirable, respected by men, and honored by her husband. Warped as it may sound, in a world where a woman's worth was measured by obedience and service, this was the only power she knew. And the guests themselves were not always monsters. Many came from the same villages or tribes. They too were raised in the same customs. Taught that accepting the wife was not exploitation but tradition. A ritual. A sacred exchange. And this is what makes it all so complex. The line between victim and participant was often blurred by generations of cultural grooming, survival instinct, and emotional confusion. Today, some Chukchi elders still defend the practice. Not as exploitation, but as misunderstood hospitality. They argue that in a land where winters last 9 months and the world ends in ice, kindness must be extreme to mean anything. That when a man gives his wife, he gives his soul. And that when a woman accepts, she preserves the tribe's sacred unity. But no words can fully mask the pain etched into the eyes of the women who lived it. Their stories are not just about sex or submission, they are about identity. About generations forced to measure love by silence, loyalty by sacrifice, and value by availability. The snow still falls in Chukotka. The tents may have given way to wooden houses and satellite dishes, but under the surface, some things remain unchanged. Today, the tradition of guest sharing is officially gone. It is not written in law, it is not taught in school, it is not openly discussed in public gatherings. Yet when anthropologists and journalists venture into the farthest reaches of this frozen land, they still hear echoes, whispers, phrases that hint at an old agreement, a quiet understanding that some rules never truly die. They just change shape. In one village, a visitor might be offered a woman's company with a knowing look and a carefully chosen word. In another, the guest may find himself placed beside the wife at dinner, closer than expected, with the husband politely excusing himself early in the night. It is not explicit. It is not guaranteed. But it is present. In gestures. In glances. In pauses that say more than words ever could. And what about the women, the daughters and wives of this generation? They are more connected now. More aware. They have smartphones. Sometimes even internet access. They see the world outside. And they know that their traditions are not universal, not normal, not always right. And yet knowing does not always mean freedom. Some feel guilt for questioning their ancestors, shame for wanting more, fear of being the one who breaks the chain. Because in small, tight-knit communities, tradition is more than memory. It is law. It is survival. It is identity. And to betray it is to risk losing everything, even your own family. But a shift is coming. Slow, fragile, but real. More young women now choose to leave the villages and stay in the cities, refusing to return home for arranged marriages or suspicious guest visits. Some work with NGOs that promote women's rights among indigenous groups. Others simply stay quiet, build a new life, and pray their daughters never have to face the same choices. There are voices rising from within the Chukchi community itself, calling for an honest reckoning, not to erase the past, but to understand it, to separate hospitality from control, generosity from violation, love from submission. Because if a culture cannot evolve, it calcifies and dies. The question now is whether the Chukchi will find a way to preserve what is beautiful in their traditions while letting go of what is brutal. For some, the answer is clear. It must be done. For others, the pull of history is too strong, the tent too cold, the silence too deep. And so the cycle continues, in hidden corners, behind closed doors, in the minds of women who still ask themselves quietly, am I a person or a gift? Am I loved or offered? Am I free or just borrowed? In a land where kindness was once measured by the giving of a wife, the true measure of change will not be found in laws or headlines, but in the simple private moment when a woman is finally allowed to say no and be heard, without shame, without exile, without punishment. Until then, the snow will keep falling, the fire will keep burning, and the silence will still speak louder than any tradition ever written.